True crime story of a former New Orleans police officer convicted with her lover for the killing of 3 people. The case of Antoinette Frank demonstrates the tragic consequences that can occur when an individual is given police powers while being completely unfit to carry them out. In the late 1990s, the New Orleans Police Department was at a crisis point. The department was experiencing a major turnover in officers due to the department's ineffectiveness. The pay scale for New Orleans police officers was lower than most cities of comparable size. Further, there was widespread corruption and several officers had been arrested for committing crimes, including murder and selling of drugs. The department had a requirement that they could only hire residents of New Orleans. For Antoinette Frank, born April 30, 1971, becoming a police officer was a childhood dream. She always wanted to be a police officer. Frank was accepted to the New Orleans Police Academy in the early 90s and graduated on February 28, 1993. She was granted an interview with the New Orleans Police Department the same month. It was at this point the process broke down and the seeds of a nightmare were planted. In reviewing her job application, it became evident that Frank had made some untruthful statements. Further, several psychiatric evaluations concluded that she was not suitable for hire. Despite all this damning evidence, the New Orleans Police Department decided to hire her anyway, due to their shortage of officers. In addition, Frank was black, which they thought might be useful in the department's attempts to reduce racial tensions. While on the job, fellow officers had the impression that Frank lacked the confidence and decisiveness needed to be a police officer. She came off as weak and unsure. Some went as far as to say she made irrational decisions. After 6 months on the force, Frank's supervisor wanted her to go back to the academy for further training. However, he was faced with a severe shortage of officers, so instead, he opted to team her up with a veteran officer. The proverbial pouring of gas on the fire came when Frank encountered 18-year-old Roger Lacazzi, a drug dealer who had been shot during an altercation with other dealers. Frank was assigned to take his statement. The line between professional conduct and emotional involvement dissolved as Frank and Lacazzi quickly developed feelings for each other. What started off as a desire to help Lacazzi get his life in order, soon developed into a sexual relationship. They were spending more and more time together, including when Frank was on the job. Frank was not at all shy about her relationship with Lacazzi and openly included him in her police work. She allowed him to ride with her while she was on duty and let him accompany her on police matters. She even introduced him to others as her trainee or as her nephew. One of the places Frank frequented was Kim On Vietnamese restaurant, located on the east side of New Orleans. Frank used to do security work at the restaurant and had developed a friendly relationship with its owners. They often served her free food. It was for this reason that Frank took Lacazzi to the restaurant on March 4, 1995. When Frank stopped doing security at Kim On Vietnamese restaurant, Ronald Williams replaced her. Williams was also on the force, in charge of scheduling the department's police officers, but was working security at the restaurant to supplement his income. Because of the low pay, many New Orleans police officers did security work on the side to make ends meet. When Frank and Lacazzi arrived at the restaurant, Frank introduced Lacazzi to Williams as her nephew. Williams did not fall for her lies. He recognized Lacazzi as a drug dealer he had encountered in the past. It was midnight and the restaurant owner's daughter, 24-year-old Chow Vu, was helping her brothers, Quoc and Ha, and her sister Quang, to close the restaurant. Other than Williams and the Vu children, the restaurant was empty, except Frank and Lacazzi. They had stayed past closing time, lingering to finish their meals and talk to Chow and her siblings. They finally left at 11 p.m. Chow went to the kitchen to count the money and collect Officer William's payment for his services. It was then she noticed the key to the restaurant's front door was missing. She had last seen the key before letting Frank and Lakazi out of the restaurant. After they had left, she had locked the front door from the inside. She paid Williams and mentioned to him that she was unable to find the key. Williams advised her that Lakazi was not Frank's nephew and that he could not be trusted. He explained to her about his past encounters with Lakazi. Suddenly, they heard someone at the front door demanding to be let in. Whoever was outside was banging and shaking the door. Chow rushed back to the kitchen and hid the money in a microwave oven before returning to the front of the restaurant. She saw Kwok and Kwong talking to Williams. Suddenly the front door opened, and Frank entered the restaurant. She used the key she had stolen. Williams approached Frank to confront her about the key, but Frank completely ignored him and walked with determination toward the kitchen. As she passed Kwong and Kwok, she shoved them through the kitchen door and followed behind them. Before Williams could do anything, the front door flew open. It was Lakazi. He had a 9mm pistol drawn and shot Williams in the back of the head. The bullet was shot at close range and severed William's spine, causing him to fall to the ground, unable to move. Lakazi fired 2 fatal shots, one at William's head and the other into his back. He then took William's service revolver and his wallet. Distracted by the shooting, Frank left the kitchen and headed to the front of the restaurant. Chow used the opportunity to grab Kwok and Kwong and hid them inside the walk-in cooler. She turned off the lights in the kitchen and hid inside a small storage space at the back of the kitchen. She did not know where Lakazi was. Frank and Lakazi returned to the kitchen and searched desperately for the money, which they eventually found. Now that they had the money, Frank and Lakazi opened the door of the walk-in cooler, forced Kwok and Kwong to their knees, and then shot them execution style. They searched for Chow but were unable to find her. Fearing that their shots may have been heard from outside the restaurant, they took off. Chow ran out of the restaurant to a neighboring business and used their phone to call 911. Unknown to Chow, Frank intercepted the 911 dispatcher's call and advised the dispatcher that she would respond to the shooting. When Frank arrived back at the restaurant, she ran toward Chow. Fortunately for Chow, several police officers had arrived at the restaurant before Frank did. The other officers approached Frank before she could reach Chow. Frank acted innocently and asked what was happening and if Chow was all right. Chow was terrified and in disbelief. The person who had killed her siblings was now acting as though she wanted to help. The officers sensed Chow's fear and told Frank not to leave. One of the officers took Chow aside and, in broken English, she told them what happened. Chow explained that Frank and Lakazi were the ones who had robbed the family's restaurant and murdered her brother and sister. The police took Frank into custody and brought her to the station for interrogation. She told the detectives what had happened and even disclosed where she had dropped off Lakazi. Frank was charged and Lakazi was later picked up and taken into custody. They were interviewed separately, with each one implicating the other. Frank stated she shot Chow's siblings because Lakazi forced her to at gunpoint, while Lakazi claimed Frank was the mastermind behind the operation. Frank and Lakazi were indicted by a grand jury April 28, 1995. Lakazi's trial began July 17, 1995 and lasted 5 days. Frank's trial began September 5, 1995. The defense had subpoenaed 40 witnesses, yet not one of the witnesses was called to testify. The jury deliberated for 22 minutes on September 12, 1995, returning with a guilty verdict, which was a record for a capital murder case in the city of New Orleans. During the penalty phase, it took only 45 minutes for the jury to decide to give Lakazi the death penalty. Frank became the first police officer to be convicted of killing another police officer and was sentenced to death on October 20, 1995. Frank's attorney appealed to the Louisiana Supreme Court, arguing against the death sentence by presenting testimony from a psychiatrist who had evaluated Frank. The evaluation concluded Frank was suffering from trauma and diagnosed her with narcissistic personality disorder. The Louisiana Supreme Court ruled Frank should face the death penalty as previously judged. Frank was sent to death row at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, located near Baton Rouge. She was only the second woman in Louisiana's history to be sent to death row. About 2 years before the murders at the Kim On Vietnamese restaurant, Frank's father, Adam Frank, disappeared and was reported missing. The last time he had been seen was at his daughter's home, where he had been staying. In November 1995, 1 month after Frank was found guilty, someone reported a foul smell coming from her home. A canine unit was sent in and the police found a human skull under the house. The skull had a bullet hole in it. It was identified as Adam Frank. Because Antoinette Frank was already facing the death penalty, no further charges were pursued. During the trial, 2 witnesses testified that on February 4, 1995, they had witnessed Frank and Lakazi engage in criminal activity unrelated to the shooting at the restaurant. The witnesses, John Stevens and Anthony Wallace, testified that Stevens had an altercation with Lakazi after leaving a party they had attended. Stevens was about to get into a fight with Lakazi, but Wallace convinced him to leave, and they did. Stevens and Wallace drove away in order to avoid a fight. After a few minutes of driving, they were pulled over by a police car. The officer was Frank. Frank ordered both men out of their car. When they did, Wallace saw Lakazi holding a gun. Wallace charged at Lakazi and the 2 men got into a fight. When police backup arrived, Frank told the officers that Wallace was the bad guy and that Lakazi was the good guy. Wallace was arrested and charged with attempted murder and armed robbery. As in the Yesuji case, Frank is an example of what happens when the institutions that are supposed to serve us take shortcuts. The New Orleans Police Department bestowed the power of the badge onto a tormented soul. Thanks for watching. Please share and subscribe on my YouTube channel and follow me on Facebook on @MunpyStories for more.